19th December 1941, Alexandria Harbor, Egypt. 0600 hours, HMS Queen Elizabeth. Battleship. Displacement 31,000 tons. Flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet, sits at her berth. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commander of the fleet, is aboard. The ship appears normal. Crew performs morning duties. Flags are raised. The routine is ordinary. Beneath the waterline, the ship is sinking. A massive hole has been torn in her hull by 600 kilograms of explosive. Water is flooding into compartments. The ship is settling onto the harbor bottom. Within hours, she will be resting on mud in 15 meters of water. Her keel will be on the bottom. Her deck will be above water. She will appear afloat. She will not be 50 meters away. HMS Valiant, also a battleship, also 31,000 tons, is experiencing identical crisis. Flooding, settling, sinking in place. Both battleships, the core of British Mediterranean naval power, have been destroyed in their own harbor by 6 Italian frogmen riding human torpedoes. The British do not yet know this. They know there has been an explosion. They know the ships are damaged. They do not yet understand that both battleships are crippled, that repairs will take months, that the Mediterranean fleet has lost its capital ships to a commando raid conducted with equipment that looks like children's toys. When they understand, the humiliation will be complete. The Royal Navy, which prides itself on security and readiness, has been defeated in its main base by 6 men on motorized torpedoes. The attackers escaped. The damage is catastrophic, and the British will spend the next 6 months pretending the ships are operational to prevent the Italians from knowing they succeeded. This is the story of how the greatest humiliation in Royal Navy history was inflicted by the smallest attacking force. 6 men, 3 two-man teams, riding slow-moving underwater vehicles, penetrating supposedly secure harbor defenses, placing charges under battleships, escaping, and changing the strategic balance of the entire Mediterranean theater. To understand how this happened, you need to understand both the Italian human torpedo program and the spectacular failures of British harbor defense at Alexandria. The Italian Navy developed human torpedoes, called maiali or pigs by their operators, beginning in 1935. The concept was simple: a torpedo-shaped vehicle, approximately 7 meters long, carrying 2 men seated in tandem. Electric motor providing approximately 3 knots submerged speed. Range approximately 15 kilometers. Armed with a detachable warhead containing approximately 300 kilograms of explosive. The tactic was infiltration. Approach target harbor at night. Submerge outside defenses. Navigate underwater to target ships. Attach warhead to hull below waterline. Set timer. Escape before detonation. The entire operation required stealth, navigation skill, physical endurance in cold water, and exceptional courage. The Italian Navy formed the Decima Flottiglia Mass, the 10th Light Flotilla. To operate these weapons, personnel were volunteers, extensively trained. They practiced in Italian harbors, learning to navigate underwater, to work in darkness, to place charges accurately. By 1940, the unit was operational. Early attempts against British bases failed. Raids on Gibraltar in September 1940 and October 1940 were detected. The attackers were captured or killed. The human torpedoes were destroyed. British intelligence learned of the Italian capability but assessed it as ineffective. The failures confirmed British assumptions that harbor defenses were adequate. This assessment was wrong. The Italians learned from failures. They improved tactics. They enhanced training. They waited for perfect opportunity. Alexandria in December 1941 provided that opportunity. Alexandria was the main British naval base in the eastern Mediterranean. The harbor was large, well protected, heavily defended. Anti-submarine nets guarded the entrance. Patrol boats circled continuously. Searchlights swept the water. The defenses appeared formidable, but they had vulnerabilities. The anti-submarine nets had to open to allow ships to enter and exit. During these openings, gaps existed. Patrol boats followed predictable patterns. Searchlights could not cover all areas simultaneously, and British doctrine assumed that attacks would come from outside, from submarines or surface ships, not from within the harbor. The Italians planned to exploit these assumptions. The raid was scheduled for December, when British fleet strength would be concentrated at Alexandria. The submarine Sirte would transport 3 human torpedoes to within striking distance. 6 operators would ride the torpedoes into the harbor, attack the battleships, and escape. The crew was selected carefully. Lieutenant Luigi Duran de la Pen commanded the mission. He was paired with Petty Officer Emilio Bianchi. Their target was HMS Valiant. Captain Antonio Marseglia and Petty Officer Spartaco Shergat would attack HMS Queen Elizabeth. Captain Vincenzo Martellota and Petty Officer Mario Marino would target a tanker. These men were volunteers. They understood the risks. Capture was probable. Death was possible. Success was uncertain. They went anyway, not from fanaticism but from professionalism. This was their mission. They would execute it. Shira departed La Spezia on 3 December 1941. The voyage to Alexandria took 15 days. The submarine traveled submerged during day, surfaced at night to charge batteries and ventilate. British anti-submarine patrols were active, but Shira avoided detection. On 18 December, she arrived at the release point approximately 1.3 kilometers from Alexandria Harbor. At 20:30 hours on 18 December, the 3 human torpedoes launched. The 6 operators mounted their vehicles. They submerged. Shira departed, leaving them alone in the dark Mediterranean. The infiltration began. The approach was slow. 3 knots maximum speed. Navigation by compass and watch. No surface reference points. The operators steered toward the harbor, guided by the glow of lights and the silhouettes of ships against the sky. They had to reach the anti-submarine net before it closed for the night. At approximately 2100 hours, a British destroyer exited the harbor. The anti-submarine net opened to allow passage. The Italian human torpedoes followed the destroyer through the gap. British lookouts saw nothing. The water was dark. The human torpedoes were barely visible even in daylight. At night, they were invisible. Inside the harbor, the operators oriented themselves. They could see the battleships moored along the quay. Queen Elizabeth and Valiant were clearly identifiable by size and silhouette. The tanker was nearby. The teams separated. Each proceeded to their assigned target. De la Pen and Bianchi approached Valiant. They submerged to approximately 3 meters depth and navigated under the battleship's hull. The human torpedo carried the warhead in its nose. The procedure was to position the vehicle under the target's keel, detach the warhead, place it on the harbor bottom directly beneath the ship, set the timer, and escape. But the human torpedo malfunctioned. The vehicle lost buoyancy and sank to the harbor bottom at approximately 15 meters depth. De la Pen and Bianchi were trapped underwater with failing equipment. They had 2 options: surface and be captured, or attempt to manhandle the warhead into position manually. They chose the manual option. De la Pen descended to the bottom, detached the warhead, and dragged it across the mud to position it under Valiant's keel. The warhead weighed approximately 300 kilograms. Moving it underwater in diving equipment was exhausting. De la Pen worked for over an hour. Bianchi assisted until his oxygen ran low. He surfaced and was immediately captured by British patrol. De la Pen continued alone. He positioned the warhead. He set the timer for 0600 hours. He surfaced at approximately 0300 hours and was also captured. Both men were taken aboard Valiant for interrogation. They refused to explain what they had done. They were placed in a compartment below decks to await further questioning. Marseglia and Shergat had better success. They reached Queen Elizabeth without mechanical failure. They submerged under the battleship's hull. They placed their warhead directly beneath the forward magazines. They set the timer for 0600 hours. They surfaced outside the harbor and attempted to escape on foot. They were captured approximately 2 hours later by Egyptian police. Martellata and Marino attacked the tanker Sagona and destroyer HMS Jervis moored nearby. They placed their warhead between the 2 ships. Timer set for 0600 hours. They attempted escape, but were captured before leaving the harbor area. By 0400 hours, all 6 Italians were in British custody. 5 of the 6 human torpedoes had been lost or abandoned. The mission appeared to be a failure. The Italians were interrogated but revealed nothing. British intelligence concluded the raid had been ineffective. At 0550 hours, De la Pen, still imprisoned aboard Valiant, requested to speak to the ship's captain. He was brought to Captain Charles Morgan. De la Pen stated that a large explosive device was positioned under the ship and would detonate in approximately 10 minutes. He recommended evacuating the crew. Morgan did not believe him initially. This could be a trick to create panic, but the Italian's manner was serious. Morgan ordered partial evacuation. Non-essential crew were sent ashore. Key personnel remained to assess the threat. At 0600 hours, exactly, the warhead under Valiant detonated. The explosion was massive. 600 kilograms of explosive detonating against the hull below the waterline. The force tore a hole approximately 6 meters across. Water flooded into the ship at enormous rate. She began settling immediately. Seconds later, the warhead under Queen Elizabeth detonated. Similar damage. Massive flooding. The battleship began settling onto the harbor bottom. The explosion under Saginaw and Jervis also detonated, damaging both vessels, though less severely than the battleships. The damage to Queen Elizabeth and Valiant was catastrophic. Both ships settled onto the mud bottom within 30 minutes. The water depth was approximately 15 meters. The ship's drafts were approximately 9 meters. This meant the hulls were resting on bottom, but the superstructures remained above water. From distance, the ships appeared afloat. This created an unusual situation. The battleships were clearly sunk. They were resting on the harbor bottom. They could not move. They had no combat capability. But they appeared operational to anyone who did not know they were sitting on mud. Admiral Cunningham made an immediate decision. The British would conceal the damage. The battleships would appear operational. Crew would remain aboard. Normal routines would continue. Flags would be raised. Launches would run to shore. Anyone observing from distance would see functioning battleships. The deception was necessary for strategic reasons. If the Italians knew both British battleships were sunk, they would understand that British naval power in the Mediterranean was broken. The Italian fleet could operate more aggressively. Convoys to North Africa would be less vulnerable. The strategic balance would shift decisively. Maintaining the deception required commitment. The crews lived aboard ships that were sunk. They performed duties on vessels resting on harbor bottom. They maintained appearance of normalcy, while salvage crews worked below decks to patch the damage and eventually refloat the ships. The deception succeeded initially. Italian reconnaissance aircraft photographed Alexandria regularly. They saw Queen Elizabeth and Valiant at their berths. The ships appeared operational. Flags were flying. Crew were visible. The photographs showed no obvious damage. Italian intelligence concluded the raid had failed or caused minimal damage, but rumors circulated. The captured raiders eventually revealed what they had done. Egyptian sources reported massive explosions in the harbor. Italian intelligence began questioning whether the battleships were truly operational. The British maintained the fiction. Orders went to crews: appear normal, show no signs of damage, act as if nothing happened. The repair work was extensive. Both battleships had to be patched sufficiently to be pumped dry and refloated. This required working in flooded compartments, sealing the hull breaches, installing temporary patches. The work took weeks. During this time, the ships remained on the bottom while appearing afloat. Queen Elizabeth was refloated on 2 January 1942. Valiant was refloated on 7 January. Both were then moved to dry docks for permanent repairs. The damage was assessed comprehensively. Queen Elizabeth required approximately 8 months of repairs. Valiant required approximately 6 months. Neither ship would be combat effective until late 1942. The strategic impact was immediate. Without battleships, the Mediterranean fleet could not challenge the Italian battle fleet. British convoy operations to Malta became far more dangerous. Italian convoys to North Africa operated with less interference. The balance of naval power shifted. The British attempted to compensate. Cruisers and destroyers increased operations. Submarines hunted Italian convoys. Aircraft attacked shipping, but without battleships to threaten the Italian battle fleet. These operations were riskier. The loss of Queen Elizabeth and Valiant weakened British strategic positions significantly. The Italians eventually learned the truth. Intelligence reports and reconnaissance gradually revealed that the battleships were under repair. By February 1942, Italian Naval Command understood that both British battleships had been sunk. The raid had succeeded completely. The 6 Italian operators became heroes. They had been captured, but they had succeeded in their mission. After interrogation, they were sent to prisoner of war camps in Egypt. They survived the war and returned to Italy. All 6 received medals. De la Penne received the Medaglia d'Oro al Valor Militare, Italy's highest military decoration. After the war, British and Italian naval personnel met occasionally. De la Penne visited Britain in 1952. He met with officers who had been aboard Valiant during the raid. The conversations were cordial, professional. The British acknowledged the Italian achievement. The raid had been brilliantly executed. The damage had been severe. The humiliation was complete, but the respect was genuine. The raid became a case study in special operations. The tactics were analyzed extensively. How had 6 men penetrated supposedly secure defenses? What failures allowed the attack to succeed? What lessons could be learned? The analysis identified multiple British failures. First, the anti-submarine nets were ineffective. They had to open regularly, creating gaps. The Italians exploited these gaps. Better procedures were needed to prevent infiltration during openings. Second, harbor patrol was inadequate. The patrol boats followed predictable patterns. They did not cover all areas. They were not equipped to detect submerged threats. Enhanced patrol procedures and better detection equipment were necessary. Third, underwater defenses were minimal. No sonar detection in the harbor. No barriers beneath ships. No continuous monitoring of underwater approaches. The harbor was defended against surface and air threats but not against underwater infiltration. Fourth, intelligence failed to assess the Italian capability accurately. Early raid failures had created false confidence. The assumption was that human torpedoes were ineffective. This assumption prevented proper defensive measures. These failures combined to create vulnerability. The Italians identified it and exploited it perfectly. The raid succeeded not because Italian capability was extraordinary, but because British defenses were inadequate. The lessons were applied. British harbors received enhanced underwater defenses. Anti-submarine nets were improved. Patrol procedures changed. Detection equipment was installed. The vulnerability that allowed the Alexandria raid was corrected. But the corrections came too late for Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. Both ships were sunk in their own harbor by an attack the British should have prevented. The humiliation was profound. The Royal Navy prided itself on readiness and security. To lose 2 battleships to a commando raid in their main base was embarrassing beyond measure. The crews who lived aboard the sunk ships while maintaining the deception performed admirably. They continued duties knowing their ships were resting on mud. They maintained morale despite the absurdity. They preserved the fiction that kept the Italians uncertain about their success. This deception was psychologically difficult. The crew knew their ships were sunk. They could feel the ships were not floating properly, but they had to act as if nothing was wrong. This required discipline and commitment. The crews provided both. After the ships were refloated and repaired, they returned to service. Queen Elizabeth rejoined the fleet in June 1943. Valiant returned in July 1943. Both participated in operations for the remainder of the war. They survived to see victory, but the 6 months they spent sunk in Alexandria Harbor, with crews living aboard maintaining the fiction of operational capability, remained the strangest period of their service. Battleships are not supposed to be sunk in harbor. They are not supposed to rest on bottom while crews pretend they are afloat. The situation was unprecedented. The Italian raid on Alexandria proved that even the most powerful warships are vulnerable. Battleships, with their massive armor and guns, seem invincible, but a few hundred kilograms of explosive placed correctly can cripple them. The 6 Italian frogmen demonstrated this conclusively. The raid also demonstrated the value of unconventional warfare. 6 men on human torpedoes achieved what entire Italian fleet could not. They penetrated British defenses. They attacked the most heavily defended targets. They succeeded. The lesson was clear: small, well-trained units using unconventional methods can achieve strategic effects. This lesson influenced special operations development throughout the war. The British formed similar units. Chariots, British human torpedoes, were developed and deployed. X-craft midget submarines were used against turpits. Commandos raided harbors and installations. The Italian success at Alexandria validated the entire concept. The 6 Italians who conducted the raid became legendary. After the war, they were interviewed extensively. They described the training, the approach, the placement of charges, the capture. They expressed no regret about attacking British ships. They had been soldiers executing their mission. The British were enemies then. After the war, they were former enemies, professionals who could respect each other's skill. De la Penne's decision to warn the British before the explosion demonstrated this professionalism. He could have remained silent. The detonation would have killed British sailors who had no warning, but he warned Captain Morgan. This gave time for partial evacuation. Many British lives were saved by that warning. This act was recognized after the war. British officers who had been aboard Valiant acknowledged that de la Penne's warning had saved lives. He had been an enemy conducting an attack, but he had been an honorable enemy. When the attack was complete, he acted to minimize unnecessary casualties. The historical assessment of the Alexandria raid is unanimous. It was one of the most successful special operations of the war. 6 men disabled 2 battleships. The cost was 0 Italian casualties. All 6 captured but surviving the war. The British lost combat effectiveness of 2 capital ships for 6 months. The strategic balance shifted. The tactical achievement was remarkable, but the raid also revealed systemic British failures. Harbor defenses were inadequate. Intelligence assessment was wrong. Procedures were flawed. The Italians exploited these failures brilliantly, but the failures should not have existed. The British had warning from earlier raids. They knew Italian capability existed. They failed to defend properly. This combination of Italian excellence and British failure created the perfect raid. The attackers executed flawlessly. The defenders failed completely. 2 battleships were sunk in their own harbor by 6 men on motorized torpedoes. The image of HMS Queen Elizabeth and Valiant sitting on the harbor bottom while their crews maintained appearance of normalcy is absurd and tragic. Battleships displacing 31,000 tons each, armed with 8 15-inch guns each, capable of 30 knots, reduced to stationary hulks resting on mud in 15 meters of water. Giants sunk in a puddle. The puddle was Alexandria Harbor. The giants were British battleships. The attackers were 6 Italian frogmen. The result was the greatest humiliation in Royal Navy history and the most successful special operation by Italian forces. The British concealed it. The Italians discovered it. The strategic balance shifted, and 2 battleships spent 6 months pretending to be afloat while resting on the bottom. This is the story of HMS Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. The giants sunk in a puddle. The battleships destroyed by human torpedoes. The ships that appeared operational while sitting on mud. The raid succeeded. The deception worked briefly. The repairs took months. The strategic impact lasted the rest of the war, and 6 Italian frogmen became legends for achieving what entire fleets could not. They sunk 2 battleships in the enemy's main base. They escaped with their lives. They changed the war. That is enough. That is the legacy. That is why Alexandria matters. The giants were sunk. The puddle was shallow. The humiliation was complete, and the British had to live aboard their sunk ships pretending they were still afloat. That image captures everything. The absurdity, the shame, the desperate deception, the refusal to admit defeat even when sitting on the bottom. HMS Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, giants sunk in a puddle, by 6 men on human torpedoes. In their own harbor, the Royal Navy's worst day, the Italian Navy's finest hour. Both are true. Both are remembered. Both matter. The giants sunk. The puddle proved deep enough to hide them. The deception sustained long enough to matter. And 6 Italians earned their place in history for the perfect raid, perfectly executed. That is the story. Complete. Humiliating. Unforgettable. The giants. The puddle. The 6 men who sunk them. Alexandria. 19th December 1941. The day battleships learned they were vulnerable. The day the British learned their defenses failed. The day 6 Italians changed the Mediterranean War. The giants sunk. The story survives. The lesson endures. Never assume you are safe in your own harbor. Never underestimate 6 determined men. Never forget that giants can be sunk in puddles if the attackers are brave and the defenders are complacent. Alexandria proved all 3. The giants sank. The puddle was shallow. The 6 men succeeded. That is enough to remember.